Lily's doll. When my grandmother passed away, the old family house came into my possession. It was a creaky Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, filled with cobweb memories and old secrets. According to her will, I was supposed to stay in the house for at least 1 month before making any decisions about what to do with it. It seemed like a good chance to save on rent while I figured out what to do next. I arrived at the house on a cool autumn evening. As I stepped inside, the front door let out a long squeaking sound. The kind that makes you question just how much weight it can bear. Dust floated in the air, visible in the fading daylight, and there was this odd smell. Something like musty wood mixed with old flowers that had long since wilted. After dropping my bags in the old master bedroom, I started exploring the place. Most of the rooms were empty, with just a few relics of the past, an ancient rocking chair that creaked with every gust of wind, and a grandfather clock that seemed frozen in time. By midnight, I was ready to crash, so I settled into bed. That's when I first heard it, a rhythmic, soft thud coming from the attic above. At first, I dismissed it as a small animal or maybe a loose window, but the sound felt too deliberate, like someone or something was moving around up there. Unable to sleep, I grabbed my phone and headed towards the attic. The narrow staircase creaked with every step, and the old door at the top was stiff. When I shoved it open, it gave way with a slow, almost theatrical whine. I turned on my phone's flashlight, lighting up the cluttered space. Forgotten trunks, furniture covered in sheets, and a lot of dust. And then I saw it. A doll, perched on top of a wooden chest in the corner. It was large, with unnervingly pale porcelain skin and bright, icy blue eyes. The doll wore an old-fashioned dress, tattered and stained by time. Its smile was subtle, yet unsettling, like it knew a secret it wasn't supposed to share. I leaned in, holding my breath. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, almost like a breath coming from right next to me. I looked around, but there was no one there. Feeling unnerved, I left the attic, shutting the door behind me and trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. It began with soft tapping noises, but then I started hearing footsteps. At night, there would be bursts of childlike laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. One night, I woke up with that heavy feeling of being watched. Half asleep, I sat up and nearly choked on my scream. Somehow the doll was sitting in a chair at the foot of my bed. But how? I had left it in the attic. I decided to put the doll back in the attic and lock the door. I grabbed it, trying to ignore how unsettlingly lifelike the porcelain felt. As I climbed the stairs, each step creaked louder than the last. When I reached the attic, I pushed the door open and practically threw the doll inside. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. Panic set in as I fumbled with the doorknob. It was locked tight. I took out my phone to call for help, but the battery died instantly, leaving me in complete darkness. That's when I heard the slow, deliberate scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. I turned back towards the center of the attic, and there it was. The doll's head was now fully turned towards me, its eyes reflecting a faint glimmer of moonlight from a broken window. The whisper returned, louder this time, and the words were unmistakable.
"Come play, please."
In pure terror, I threw myself at the door, pounding and screaming until it finally flew open. I stumbled down the stairs and out of the house, barely stopping to grab my car keys. The doll's voice echoed behind me as I ran.
"Don't leave me."
In the car, I plugged my phone into a power bank and called my mother. I needed to understand why my grandmother would have kept something like that in her attic. My mother was quiet for a long time before she finally explained. The doll had belonged to my great-aunt Lily, my grandmother's younger sister. She died when she was just 10 years old in that very house. No one ever talked about Aunt Lily much. It was always considered a tragedy better left forgotten. My grandmother had kept the doll all these years, locked away in the attic, as if trying to keep a part of Lily close, even though it seemed the doll carried something far darker with it. Determined to end it for good, I went back to the house. I retrieved the doll and, with trembling hands, took it to the old cemetery on the other edge of the town. I buried it there, under the roots of an old tree, and whispered, "Rest now," as I covered it with dirt. The moment I stood up, I felt a strange lightness, like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in days, I felt calm. I sold the house and I never looked back. But even now, every once in a while, I wake up in the middle of the night with that same uneasy feeling, convinced I hear the soft whisper of a child asking,
Come play, please.
Burned but not forgotten. For the past few weeks, something strange has been happening in my dreams. They all varied in setting and characters, but there was one detail that tied them together. A doll. It wasn't just any doll. It was old, made of fabric, with buttons for eyes and an unnervingly wide, stitched-on smile. The doll had long, tangled red hair, matted in some places and wild in others, giving it an eerie, lifelike quality. It wore a green dress that was worn and tattered, frayed along the hem and sleeves. The fabric looked stained and aged, as if it had been through countless owners. The way the doll's head seemed to tilt slightly, its smile ever present, gave it an aura that was deeply unsettling. It felt like it was watching, even though those button eyes were empty and hollow. But the strangest part was that the doll wasn't a focal point in my dreams. It stayed in the background, sitting on a dresser, tucked in the shadows, or clutched by some unknown child. It was always there, but never quite in focus. As the nights went on, I started having more frequent episodes of sleep paralysis. Always in the early hours of the morning, I'd wake up unable to move, my eyes wide open, staring at my dimly lit room. And every time I'd see her, the doll, sitting on my bookshelf. A chill would creep up my spine, my heart pounding as I struggled to move a finger, blink, anything. The doll's wide smile and empty button eyes seemed to be staring right at me. Then, just as quickly as it came, the paralysis would release me. But the unease stayed. Last night, things took a darker turn. I woke up in the dead of night, heart racing, the vivid image of the doll etched into my memory. Unable to sleep, I grabbed my sketchbook. I don't know why, but I felt an irresistible urge to draw it. To capture the image of the doll on paper, my fingers moved almost of their own accord, sketching her crooked grin and those unsettling eyes. Just as I was finishing the last detail, an overwhelming wave of exhaustion hit me, as if my energy had been drained completely. The sketchbook slipped from my hands as I collapsed back into sleep. The next morning, I showed the drawing to my mom. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a laugh or a curious comment, but what I got instead was terrifying. My mom stared at the sketch, her face going pale, her breath hitching in her throat. She shook her head slowly, whispering something under her breath. When I asked her what was wrong, she looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy, and muttered, "It's impossible." I watched that doll burn. I sat her down, giving her a cup of tea, and asked her to explain. After a few moments of silence, she began to talk, her voice trembling as she spoke. When she was a child, she had a doll, the very same one I had sketched. It was a gift, hand-sewn by my grandmother. She had named it Lila. Lila was her favorite toy. She took her everywhere, slept with her every night. Then one day, she lost Lila outside. My mom was devastated, cried for days. But a week later, the doll reappeared on her dresser. Not a single thing out of place, as if it had never been gone. My grandparents swore they hadn't found it, nor did they know how it had returned. Being a child, my mom had believed that somehow the doll had found its way back on its own. But after Lila returned, things changed. My mom told me that she would often find the doll in places she hadn't left it. She'd tuck it into her toy chest, only to find it sitting on her desk later that night. At first, she thought it was a prank, maybe my uncle messing with her. But soon, the entire family started to notice. Lila would disappear for days, only to reappear in her usual spot. Sitting upright on the dresser, her stitched smile wide and constant. Years passed, and the doll remained, although my mom had stopped playing with her. She didn't know why, but something about Lila started to make her uneasy. When my mom was pregnant with me, Lila still sat on her childhood dresser. That's when the scariest incident happened. My mom had never told me this part before, that she almost lost me during her pregnancy. She woke up one night covered in blood, terrified, my dad rushing her to the hospital. Miraculously, I was okay, and so was she. But my dad told her something she couldn't understand. He said that when he came into the room to get her, the doll, Lila, was lying next to her in bed. My mom didn't remember bringing it there. She hadn't touched Lila in years. When they returned from the hospital, there she was, back on the dresser, but now with a tiny stain of blood on the back of her dress. That was the final straw for my mom. She couldn't bear the sight of Lila any longer. She decided to get rid of her once and for all. One evening, she took the doll to the backyard, started a fire in the metal drum they used for burning leaves, and threw Lila in. My mom watched until the fabric was reduced to ash, until there was no trace of the doll left. After that, she never thought of Lila again. Not until now. My mom stared at me across the kitchen table, her hands trembling around her cup of tea. "I don't understand how you've seen her," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But that doll, she's not supposed to exist anymore." That night, I locked my sketchbook in a drawer, hoping that would be enough to keep Lila away. But I could feel it. Something had shifted. The air in my room felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, made my heart race. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. My room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I couldn't move. The familiar weight of sleep paralysis pinned me down. My eyes darted around the room, and there, in the corner, I saw her. Lila, sitting on my dresser, her head tilted slightly to the side, her button eyes glinting in the dim light. But this time, something was different. Slowly, ever so slowly, her head turned. The stitched smile seemed wider now, almost as if it was mocking me. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct in my body screaming to move, to get up, to run. But I couldn't. I was trapped, my body refusing to obey. Lila's head continued to turn, her button eyes locking onto mine. I could hear a faint sound, like fabric stretching, threads pulling tight. The smile on her face seemed to grow, inch by inch, until it was a grotesque, gaping grin. I don't know how long I laid there, staring at her. Unable to move, unable to look away. But just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I gasped as my body awoke from the paralysis. I scrambled out of bed, my eyes darting to the dresser. It was empty. The doll was gone.